Who was responsible for this? The question landed in the room like a thrown stone. It made the chandeliers shiver. It made the clock on Giovanni Moretti's mahogany desk sound louder than it had any right to. His voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that cut through the noise of servants and silver polish and the soft music that always seemed to be playing somewhere in the East Wing. It wasn't a shout. It was a verdict wrapped in velvet. I had been invisible for 8 months. You learn a lot about being invisible when your work is to clean other people's lives. I knew which crystal held the faintest smudge, which knot in the Persian rug would hide the crumbs from dinner, the exact point on the marble staircase that would show the first wear from shoes. I could move through the rooms without disturbing the air, like a shadow that knows the pattern of the light. The mansion was a place of surfaces, polished, curated surfaces, and I kept them faithful to their shine. Outside those rooms, the city was different. My Bronx apartment smelled like frying rosemary and laundry soap. Brittany, my sister, kept the stove on as if warmth could stitch us together. We had a small mattress that smelled faintly of lavender from too many washes, a single window that let in the city's blue at dawn. When I left for work at 6, the sky was a smear of navy. When I came back at midnight, there were puddles that caught the lights from the bodega across the street. $47,000. That number had a way of following me from mattress to mansion. It didn't make sense with the crystal and the chandeliers and the chauffeur who polished the black car until it shone like an accusation. It made sense when I looked at my mother's insurance statements, at the boxes of invoices on the kitchen table, at the way Brittany hummed when she sliced onions because she was saving the sound of normal. 47,000 felt like a weight on the back of my neck, a ledger that named me and kept me small. I worked overtime because debt has teeth. Overtime bought antibiotics for my mother, paid for specialist appointments that my insurance only half covered, kept us from moving back to the old neighborhood where rent was lower, and the hospital beds smelled most nights like bleach and regret. I worked nights because silence paid better. The mansion needed more hands to ghost through it when the guests were gone, when the private dinners had been cleared and the chandeliers dimmed. I took pride in being invisible, because invisibility kept me out of the room where people like Giovanni made decisions that weren't meant to touch my life, but inevitably did. Rosa, the head housekeeper, kept me in my place with an economy of looks. She had run the household for longer than I had known how to fold a fitted sheet. Rosa's glance said more than a reprimand. It said, keep to the edges. It said, don't ask. "I can stay home?" Brittany offered. She was our firewall, pragmatic and blunt, and always half a step from sarcasm. "Let me call boss lady. Tell her I'm sick. Let me—" No, I pushed my hair back from my face. The motion hurt. I counted the cost like you count bones through water. Missing work meant missing overtime. Missing overtime meant sending home answers that said you couldn't manage. Missed payments, dropped stitches in the ragged tapestry we called security. I have to go. She wrapped my ribs with a scarf in a way that made me feel like maybe she didn't want to watch me disappear. "Promise me you'll tell Rosa," she said, eyes like knives gentled by worry. Rosa noticed things. Rosa was the only one who could keep the household's invisible rules from turning men into monsters by simply sweeping them under another carpet. "I'll tell her," I said, and it was half the truth. At the mansion, mirrors are full of other people's faces. I moved through them with a practiced arm. The chandeliers threw light like currency. The floors smelled faintly of lemon oil and something sweet Giovanni burned in his office after long days. I kept my face calm when Rosa met me at the side door with a look that said, "Don't make me send you home." She offered me a damp cloth for the bruise on my jaw, folded it like she was tucking me into an argument the house wouldn't allow. "You should see a doctor," she said, then softened. "You will tell him, yes?" I wanted to tell Giovanni. I wanted to tell him everything in the language of truth. that I had been waiting tables that his guests never saw, that I had walked home at night because our debt had teeth, that someone had thought using my uniform as a threat was an efficient way to speak to him. Instead, I told Rosa the version that kept me at work. A fall, a foolish misstep, clumsy, nothing for anyone to worry about. But nothing likes to stay nothing. The mansion had watches in the corners you forget are there until they notice you. That evening, I was called to the study. Giovanni's study smelled of cigar and a faint sweetness under the leather. Honey, maybe, or something he used to keep his hands. He stood by the window, looking out over a city he treated like a chessboard. When he turned to me, he saw me as if he had just learned the scale of a color he'd never registered. It wasn't sympathy he offered, it was attention, the kind that changes the angles of a face. He raised his hand and with the gentlest insistence asked me to sit. "Tell me," he said, the same quiet as the question that had opened the night. I told him a partial truth. The alley, rain, 2 men, the emblem on my jacket. I didn't say the word message out loud. I tried to make my voice small. I tried to make my life smaller so it would fit into the margins he allowed me. He listened with an economy of motion. No grand gestures, only a stillness that magnified what he said next. "Show me," Giovanni asked. His staff brought a still from the security cameras, grainy, the colors bled by rain. I saw myself a second later in the feed, small and pale against the wet street, the men close like bad weather. Franco had already been on the case. Franco's face as he stood at the monitor was a map of loyalty, efficient, flat lines framing a man who kept the edges sharp so that Giovanni's world could be soft where Giovanni preferred it. Franco rewound and paused. The faces of the attackers filled the screen, unremarkable if you didn't know them. The names flashed up on the corner of the feed: Darren Cole, Victor. Giovanni's hand landed on the desk. The light through the window made the scar on his knuckle a white slash. He asked the question again, but this time his voice bore the meaning of that old question: who was responsible for this? But pointed outward, toward people who used violence like a language and who understood the code for messages. He didn't call them a message, he called it an infringement. That was his word for everything that smelled of threat. Infringement came out of him like smoke and forewarning, irritated, protective, and cold. The mansion, he said, was a map he measured with property and people, and anyone who marked it without asking did not deserve an answer. They deserved a correction. "I want them found," he said, "now." I felt something inside me split. Part of me, a smaller, angular piece that knew the city's rules, felt relief. If he found them, they couldn't come back to threaten the hospital bills and the late notices. If he found them, maybe the fear would stop. Another part of me, older and windier, felt like the night I'd been on the floor. The smallness of the blow, the flash of the emblem catching neon. I had never wanted violence to tidy my life. I had wanted to pay the bills. "I don't want them hurt on account of me," I said. Giovanni looked at me as if he were measuring how much the words weighed. He didn't answer that night with a promise or a lecture. He said instead that he would take care of my medical bill and asked if I would see Dr. Caruso in the morning. It was offered like a trade, protection and care for my silence about the city's politics. Dr. Caruso was the kind of doctor who kept his own ledger clean and whose hands were steady enough to make braced ribs feel less like punishment. He was the kind of help that came attached, in this world, to an obligation. There is a way to offer protection that makes it feel like a kindness, and a way to offer protection that is a closing of the gate. Giovanni's offer was both. He documented my injuries, arranged the X-ray as if a man tying his tie, and had Franco tell me to stay away from the subway entrance on the west side for a while. He said he'd have a car drive me home. He said it as if he was giving me an option. "Do you want me to?" he began. I answered before I knew I had chosen. Yes. I chose protection the same way you choose a door when the rain will soak the room if you don't close it. The choice felt like small betrayal, like ripping a strip from the tarp of my life and throwing it across a leak. I accepted the car. That night, the house felt quieter. I lay awake and thought about names, Darren Cole and Victor, and about the way the alley had learned my uniform. I thought about the shape of things, and the cost that haunts lines, who you are when everything has a price. I thought about the way Giovanni's hand had landed on the desk, as if it were a pulse he could steady with his palm. I wondered what it meant to be kept, and to be kept safe by someone who measured safety in terms of territory and orders. The next morning, Franco, had a way of moving that made the mansion's machinery seem clean. He was efficient in the way janitors know how to be when they're cleaning up after storms. He showed me the faces from the feed again, but this time he had more. The back room of a bar where the men drank, a license plate, a call that made the knot in his jaw work. He opened a file and slid it to me like a thing to study. There were pictures taken that morning. Shoes tracked with the same mud as the alley, a cigarette butt, an earpiece smudged with salt. "They won't be gone long," Franco said. His voice had the kind of certainty that was less about hope and more about habit. He has always been Giovanni's precise instrument, an engineer of people. He did not smile, except once, small and brief, when he read something in the file that pleased him from the standpoint of the job. "We found Darren's angle last night. He's sloppy. Victor's patience runs out quick. We net them both tonight." "Tonight?" I echoed. The word made the floor tilt. My ribs still hurt when I shifted. "Tonight," Franco repeated. The night, in my memory, turns like a film reel when something decisive happens. There is a sense of compression, like time folding in on itself so events might align. I watched from the doorway while they brought the two men inside. Zip ties were not a dramatic instrument, just cold, efficient, and they tightened around wrists in the way handcuffs do, definitive. The men smelled of cheap cologne and old beer. They cursed in small, stupid ways. The light in the study was broad and flat. Chandeliers were turned down, but still paid witness. I stood where I could see the scene without being the scene. I felt like an extra in a play that suddenly decided I had lines to speak. Giovanni sat behind his desk like a judge who kept his robe for show. His tie was loose, and he rolled his cigarette between two fingers, like someone trying to read the burn pattern instead of the words. "You thought you could send a message," he said, when they had been unceremoniously seated. His voice was small and precise. "You thought you'd mark my people and walk away." They spat words that were meant to be insolent and were only pathetic, jerky attempts at bravery. Names were thrown out. Threats were sniffed like rebound smoke. The larger one, Darren, jerked his head toward me, the gesture of a man trying to remind someone they're still relevant. "You think," he began, then faltered under a look from Franco that made his jaw set like a hinge. Giovanni asked the question again, but this time it was aimed at them. Who was responsible for this? His hands were steady. The question wasn't a question anymore. It was an axe waiting to fall. I watched their faces. One was defiant, an old friend of adrenaline. The other looked suddenly small, like a child who had gotten lost in a store. You think the moment would make you sick. Instead, it made my throat tight, and there was a strange, hollow satisfaction that moved through me like a cold breeze. Not because I wanted anyone dead, not because I enjoyed the idea of blood. There is a satisfaction in seeing something resolve that has been gnawing at your life. There is a primitive relief when the forces that make your nights unsafe are named and located and contained. It felt like a clean stitch after a long tear. But satisfaction is a poor substitute for moral clarity. In the study, they spoke in small words. The men offered up nothing but arrogance. They called the whole thing a business transaction, something done by men who count territories like inventory. Giovanni listened. Then he stood and walked slowly around his desk, his silhouette a language of intent. He pressed the pads of his fingers on the desk as if reading the year in its grain, then looked up at me. "I don't want you involved," he said, and his voice softened in a way that didn't reach the edges of the word involved. He didn't say, "I won't," or "I promise," because he doesn't make promises he can't account for. He said, "I will make sure you're seen." Seen. The word was small and dangerous. He nodded, as if to confirm. "What does seen?" I asked. "It means you will not have to pay," he said simply. "It means there will be care and nights without walking that alley. It means we decide the terms of any message sent in our name." Terms. The word was his coin. It implied, in the quietest way, an exchange. My safety for something to be negotiated. I felt the thinness of my options stretch like a rubber band. "I don't want anything that takes away my choices," I said. "Not innocent, but needy. To go home. I want my sister not to wake up fearing bills. You will not lose your choices as long as you remember that not every choice leads to safety," he said. He moved back to the desk and looked at the men. "Tell me why you marked her." They swore. They lied. They feigned ignorance. They said names I didn't understand, like the language of a map I hadn't learned. Giovanni's smile then was small, almost without warmth. He told Franco to secure them in the study for the night. It was a way to keep them where they could be watched. It was also a way of keeping them where decisions could be made without outside interference. That night, I slept in a bedroom that felt too large and too white. The house hummed with the careful attention of people paid to keep it tidy. The car that had brought me home returned me to my sister with a driver who would not meet my eyes. Rosa arranged for stitches the next day under the care of a man with steady hands. Dr. Caruso confirmed I'd cracked a rib, prescribed rest and painkillers that would do more than the aspirin from the corner store. But the image of the two men sitting across from Giovanni thrummed in the background of everything. I felt like a chord struck and held. I thought about how you can be at once relieved and morally hollow. They had been caught. My body would heal. The debt did not evaporate. I signed the paper Giovanni had a secretary slide across, some small formality about confidentiality, a promise to not speak beyond what was necessary. It irritated me, though I didn't tear it up. There was a part of me that understood containment. When I went back to work, the mansion paid more attention to me than it had before. It was a strange thing to be noticed. Attention comes with risk if you don't draw the lines for it. Giovanni's glance at dinner was a small satellite orbiting me. There were moments when his eyes would rest on my hands, as if counting how fast they moved, how firmly they folded napkins. There was a generosity that arrived with the appointment to Dr. Caruso, the medicine, the car. There was also a territoriality. The men who had broken my ribs had also broken a code by making my uniform a symbol. Giovanni's response was a reminder of scale. Sometimes, when I scrubbed the banisters or polished the silver, I'd catch myself watching the study door and imagining the men strapped in chairs, the zip ties like punctuation marks. I imagined 1,000 versions of what might happen. In one, they were driven out and never seen again. In another, they paid for what they had done in a way that stained men like ink. In the quiet moments, I found I couldn't name which ending I wanted. I only knew the shape of the trade I'd made. My small safety for the house's weight. Brittany called me while I was setting the table for a private dinner, her voice quick and practical. "You okay?" she asked. There was a firmness in her tone that was like a bandage. "I'm alive," I said. "The car comes from the west now." "Good." She paused. "Promise me, don't walk home alone for a while. Let Rosa cover you. Let me." "I promised you I'd tell Rosa," I said. Which was true. But promises are not the same as guarantees. We had rules in our family that were not written down. We kept our heads down and our finances tidy. We made small bargains with the world. We never expected the world to offer a hand and then demand loyalty in return. But that was the noise of it. Everything in this city had an angle, even help. The stew of feelings in me congealed into a single, cold thing, dependency with edges. I needed someone to pick up the phone and make the wound visible in ways the hospital papers could not. I needed someone to ensure the men who had seen me like a target would not come back. I did not like the price that help came with, but I did not like the alternative either. Days slid into one another, each a thin file in a drawer. Franco reported movement. The men's Dale was denied. The names were connected like dots on a map. One night, I stood outside Giovanni's study and listened. The house had a rhythm of its own, like a body's quiet nocturne. A muffled voice from within, the rasp of an argument, then silence. When the men were brought back, it was different. This time there was no slurred bravado, only the dullness of men whose resources had been clipped. The zip ties bit into wrists that had tried to be tough and found themselves ordinary. They were carted in, and the smell of beer and cheap cologne made the study feel small in a way that made me want to breathe differently. They were placed before the desk like evidence. Giovanni spoke quietly, and then he did something I hadn't expected. He walked to the window, pulled the curtains a fraction, and let the dawn light touch the edges of the room. The city outside the glass stared back, unmoved, indifferent, dangerous. He turned to them and asked the same question a third time, with different weight. Who was responsible for this? I watched their faces. They dodged, they lied, they made accusations that fell flat. They sounded ragged. Under their bravado, I could sense fear, not only for themselves, but for the machinery they had tripped. In their answers, I heard names of men I didn't know and places I had never been. In their silence, I heard the city's appetite for consequence. Franco sat like a man who had already read the verdict. He motioned to two of Giovanni's men. The men moved with the surety of people who had done this before. Control, removal, a tidy ending. I felt my heart stutter. I had expected closure to make me breathe easier. Instead, it made each breath come sharper. When the men were led away, the finality of their movement felt like a door closing. I felt hollow and relieved and small all at once. I knew then that the city had drawn a line where my faint life had been, and that Giovanni had chosen how to respond. I also knew that he would carve out a way of seeing me that came with conditions. The mansion's attention came like rain after drought, welcome, and yet I wondered how much would wash away what remained of me. That night, I sat on the apartment stoop and tried to stitch together the way things had changed. Brittany leaned her head on my shoulder and hummed low, as if humming could stitch the world into usable parts. "You okay?" she asked again. "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't like that it had to be like this." "You got picked out of the dark," she said simply. "At least you got picked up." Her words were two-sided, a comfort and a warning. Because being picked up by someone like Giovanni was a rescue wearing a ring. I knew men like him had codes and calendars. I knew the city took things and redrew maps in ways that made people's lives align with a bigger ledger. I also knew that without help, the bills would swallow us. "You have to keep your head," she said. "You can't borrow trouble." In the morning, Dr. Caruso's office smelled like rubbing alcohol and certainty. He took x-rays and moved about the room with the hands of someone who had sewn lives back together without asking questions. He confirmed a cracked rib and prescribed rest, antibiotics for infection I hadn't even noticed. The paper he handed me had numbers that looked like small relief. When I told him my address, he nodded once, privately, in that way doctors nod at the things people keep to themselves. He didn't ask the questions he might have asked in another life. He treated me like someone whose wound was to be managed and not a story to be mined. "Giovanni has you on record," he said quietly, as if from habit. "He pays well for good care." That detail felt like a current under a river, present and moving, and not mine to rate. I had a meeting with Rosa that afternoon about setting the silver for a dinner. We moved through the motions of the household, folding linen, washing cutlery, rehearsing the motions of service. Rosa watched me with the quiet face of someone who has to be pragmatic about people she loves. She didn't ask for details I couldn't give. When the door to the study closed, she gestured to me to hang back, as if to protect me from the parts of power that stain. "Be careful," she said, and the word may as well have been an order and a blessing. I thought about how proximity to power rearranged the rooms you were allowed to inhabit. The mansion kept its doors locked, its staff uniformed like chess pieces. It was a place where the social invisible, maids, cooks, drivers, were known only by the tasks they performed. Now I was visible in ways that mattered, to the man who controlled territories, to people who could make a call and rearrange the lives of others. There was an oddness in that visibility. It felt like the world had turned on its axis and given me a place on the map that required me to sign papers I didn't want to sign. When the sun finally found a balance between evening and night, and the city slipped into its quieter hours, I found myself in the study again. The two men were not there. Their absence was a hollow I could touch. Giovanni lit a cigarette and held the smoke between his fingers like he held small things he wasn't ready to release. He looked older than he did by daylight, like the smoke had added a grain to him. "Do you want them punished?" he asked me, not asking me whether I'd prefer they be found, but what kind of consequence I wanted. It was an impossible question. I thought of the alley and the chest burst of pain, and the way my mother's files looked like small columns on the kitchen table. I thought of what I had traded for the car and the doctor and the quiet that allowed me to sleep with the sound of sirens far away. I thought of moral shapes and whether my hands were clean enough to decide on the price of someone else's life. "I don't want anyone to hurt because of me," I said. The lie felt clean but hollow. He nodded. "Sometimes the city requires an adjustment," he said. "Sometimes a message must be clear. Sometimes the men who send messages must be taught what it means to touch what belongs to me." The fat clock on his desk chimed once, deep and patient. I stood up because I couldn't sit still, and tried not to look like I wanted to. Giovanni stepped toward me then, and for a moment the distance between us was a geography. He did not reach forward like someone taking. He reached forward like someone offering a place to rest a burden. "You did not ask for this," he said. "You did not deserve it." "No," I agreed. Words came like contraband. "I will make it right." He had said this before. The promise was not total absolution. It was a maneuver. But it was also the first time anyone had offered to do something that would alter the ledger in our favor without making me beg. I let the promise sit like a small warmth. I tried not to imagine the ways he might make it right. There are practical solutions and final ones. In that room, with those chandeliers and that desk, both kinds existed. I felt the tug of needing to sleep and the tug of fearing what sleep might allow the city to rearrange. When I left the study, Franco gave me a look that was equal parts warning and apology. "You will see him in the morning," he said. "Stay close." I wanted to ask what happened to people who crossed lines. I wanted someone to answer with a clear moral ledger and say, "This is what justice looks like." But this is the city, and justice here is often a private equation. I knew the rules. You get protected by the rules of men who know how to collect. You pay with your silence and with the small bending of choices. There was a new clause in my life now, protection, attached like a purse to my shoulder. It made me feel safe and pinched me at the same time. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in the small kitchen and watched the clock. The house across the street kept its blinds closed like everyone else. The city hummed, but the hum had a new undertone, a steadiness, like a machine set in motion and unlikely to break because someone had just started it. I thought of Darren Cole and Victor and the faces on the grainy feed. I thought of my ribs and the way pain turned meaning into a ledger you couldn't argue with. When the phone rang early the next morning, it was him. "Stay inside," he said. His voice was simple and immovable. "Do not go near the alley. Keep your head down." "Yes," I said, and the word felt like a surrender. But surrender can also be a kind of survival. They moved men through the city in ways the city wouldn't mark. Orders were given, men took them and executed. I was told only enough to keep me safe. I was grateful and ashamed for feeling grateful. They had taken the men, Darren and Victor, and put them under watch. They were not yet judged in the way the city does its business, but I could feel the pivot happening. The small world around my broken ribs had been replaced by a larger one that measured the cost differently. I watched as the mansion's architecture of power flexed. I ran my hands over folded linen and felt the grain of cotton harden into something like armor. Protection had arrived. It had its terms. I had chosen the door. Now I had to live within the room it opened. At dawn, the city was a map washed in blue. I stood by the small window in my apartment and imagined the men who had been brought to the study, their wrists zipped and their mouths full of promises they couldn't keep. I imagined the silences that would fall over the city like snow after bombs. The mansion would feel the change, and the rival houses would count and recalibrate. The city is a ledger that never sleeps. Every action is a debit and a credit. There are nights that end, and then there are nights whose end is a new beginning. This felt like both. My life had acquired an edge. The debt still sat on the kitchen table, a small, plain thing that would be paid when the ledger read right. I had the appointment for Dr. Caruso penciled in and a car idling at the curb. I had a man who had asked me, with a voice like a bell, who was responsible for crossing his territory. I had, too, the knowledge that his answer would reshape my city. The morning after, Dr. Caruso moved around me like a careful tide. His hands were steady, his questions were quieter than the machines in the clinic. He pressed the X-ray up to the light, and I watched the shadow of my ribs like a map of a small country. "Cracked," he said, matter of fact. Then, so nothing about the world could be misread, "No displacement. Heal with rest and keep it wrapped. No heavy lifting." "How long?" I asked, because time is where money is measured for people like us. 6 weeks, he said. "If you take the meds and don't push it, you'll be functional. If you don't, you'll pay for it, slower, with more aches. Pain is an inconvenient ledger." He smiled without teeth. He had seen men and women like me before. Inconvenient ledgers. People whose lives needed fixing without fanfare. When he wrote the prescription, he folded the page to hide the cost. "Giovanni will take care of it," he added, as if that explained the margin where my life met his. It explained things with the bluntness of a ledger. Sometimes protection comes with check marks that intersect your name. The morning after, Dr. Caruso moved around me like a careful tide. His hands were steady, his questions were quieter than the machines in the clinic. He pressed the X-ray up to the light, and I watched the shadow of my ribs like a map of a small country. "Cracked," he said, matter of fact. Then, so nothing about the world could be misread, "No displacement. Heal with rest and keep it wrapped. No heavy lifting." "How long?" I asked, because time is where money is measured for people like us. 6 weeks, he said. "If you take the meds and don't push it, you'll be functional. If you don't, you'll pay for it, slower, with more aches. Pain is an inconvenient ledger." He smiled without teeth. He had seen men and women like me before. Inconvenient ledgers. People whose lives needed fixing without fanfare. When he wrote the prescription, he folded the page to hide the cost. "Giovanni will take care of it," he added, as if that explained the margin where my life met his. It explained things with the bluntness of a ledger. Sometimes protection comes with check marks that intersect your name. Franco walked me to the car with the efficiency of a man who navigated threats as a profession. He did not ask how I felt about the arrangement. He assumed the answer was preordained. People like Giovanni did things because they could. I told myself I wasn't naive. I had made a choice. Choice is not innocence. Weeks dissolved into the schedule of healing. The house arranged itself around me. Less night walking, a car at the curb at certain hours, a nurse on call who smelled faintly of menthol and wore the same calm as Dr. Caruso. Giovanni's men checked the cameras more often. The staff adjusted shifts so I wouldn't be alone on the walk to the subway. The house restructured my life out of prudence and ownership at once. At first, his attention felt like a temperature. He'd send a car and a driver to collect me, make sure I had soup waiting at the table when I came home. He moved through his obligations with an economy that made everything feel inevitable. He sent people with lists who crossed every T and dotted every I like he was keeping a book he planned to balance. He paid the pharmacy bills and told Franco to take care of the paperwork that would erase the oldest threat from the counter. When the check for my mother's debts arrived, it did not come as a dramatic flourish. A man in a clean suit handed Brittany an envelope at the back door while I was at work, his face unreadable except for the practiced softness of people used to delivering relief that would complicate lives. Brittany opened it in her kitchen, and the stack of statements fell into the light like surrender. 47,000, gone. She stared at the numbers the way you might look at an object you once thought untouchable. She breathed, and for the first time in months, her laugh came out unpinned. "Who sent this?" she asked after she called me, voice high with a treacherous mix of gratitude and curiosity. "Giovanni," I said, and the syllable sat between us like something both right and wrong. "Take him to dinner," she said, half joking and half not. "Or soul lodge him, I don't care. Just—" her list of practicalities was always brutal in its tenderness. "Don't let him run your life." "He's not running my life," I said, because denial is a polite muscle. I didn't tell her the terms. She didn't need to hear the small print. She needed the numbers cleared and my mother to breathe easier when she slept. Sometimes the currency of moral unease is not a currency you can spend when the lights need to stay on. There were nights when I felt like I was living in a house that had swallowed a small, dangerous weather. Giovanni's presence was an undercurrent. He would appear in the study doorway where the light pooled and speak in a voice that made instructions sound like offers. He would ask, "Do you need anything?" And I would say no, because I was still practicing the muscle memory of not asking too much. Then he would leave a small thing, an extra blanket, folded precisely, a mug of coffee placed where I'd find it on a tray, the steam rising like a private flag. These were small mercies that also felt like quiet claims. There was a slow choreography to our days that made intimacy possible without theater. He never entered the staff wing unannounced. He never touched me in a way that felt possessive at first. He learned the rhythm of my hands. He watched how I folded napkins with the same clinical curiosity he applied to the men he distrusted. Once, standing over a sink, I spoke what had been a rude thought, how strange it was to be both shielded and marked. "Do you regret it?" he asked later, when the house was hushed to a low hum and the chandeliers were mere constellations. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to say no. I said something nearer the truth. "I don't like the way it makes me feel." He looked at me then as if weighing whether the feeling could be eased. "I don't want you to feel like a guest at a house you keep running." The admission that followed was small and came like a dismantling gesture. "You should have more say in how you're cared for," he said. If any of it, makes you feel cornered, tell me." There it was, a promise that did not demand the shape of my gratitude. It didn't ask me to be simpler than I was. It was, I thought with a jolt, almost a question of respect. Trust, in my world, is forged in slow increments. The city didn't teach me to trust men with power. It taught me to barter for silence, to sign away nights so bills could be paid. I watched the way he listened to me, because listening is an act of valuation. He kept quiet when it would have been easier for him to own the whole thing with a forceful line. He let me speak when I wanted to. He asked things, small practical things about my mother, about money, about what would help, and he then arranged them. He paid the bills. He arranged for a driver. He sent Dr. Caruso. But he also asked permission in moments that didn't need asking, and I clung to those permissions like a lifeline. One afternoon in the library, there is always a library in mansions like this, I was straightening a shelf of books he rarely opened. I had the end of a towel wrapped around my side more securely. The crack in my rib had developed a dull companion of ache that made reaching above my head smart. He was there, as he often was, with a cigarette pinched between long fingers, watching the way I moved. "You're doing it all wrong," he said, which was his version of a joke. "Am I?" I asked, thumb finding the seam on the spine of a book. He set the cigarette down to put out in a glass ashtray and offered his hand, not to take mine, but to steady me, palm beneath my elbow as if providing a temporary scaffold. His touch was deliberate and considerate, not the quick claim I had feared. My breath hitched because proximity has always been a charged thing for me.
"Lean on me if you need," he said quietly. "If you are invisible all your life, the first hand that chooses to notice you reverberates." I felt noticed in a way that had no price tag attached in the moment. I swore to myself I would keep the boundary solid. But familiarity crept the way fog does, slowly, filling in corners until distance felt unnatural. The night he kissed me was not a planned thing. It was a thread that tightened. We'd been seated near the fire after a private dinner. 2 other men left the room and the quiet pressed in. He had been telling me about a composer he liked, his voice low and almost shy about beauty, and I had laughed in a way that surprised me. Laughter is an unobserved fissure. It lets a different light into the room. He watched the laugh settle on my face, and, when the sentence concluded between us, leaned in as if to inspect the laugh more closely. His hand brushed my cheek, a light thing. I didn't step back. I had a sudden, furious awareness of my ribs and the way breathing felt like a transaction. His other hand cupped the nape of my neck tenderly. His mouth was warm. The kiss was careful, as if he were learning the rules of the place where my lips met his. When it ended, neither of us smiled. It was a punctuation mark, not a period. He stepped away and gave me the space to speak, and I took it like a person still learning how to accept kindness without shame. "I don't want to feel," I started, searching for the word that would describe the cocktail of gratitude and fear. He let me finish. "Bought?" I offered. "No," he said, "not bought." He folded his hands together like a man who negotiated men and debts for a living, but wanted this to be different. Then he made a choice that steadied the ground between us. "I want this to be consensual, Lauren, in the plainest of ways. If at any point you feel otherwise, you say stop. You tell me to leave. You keep your options." It was blunt, functional, and, under the circumstances, generous. He treated consent like a professional matter, with protocols and the plainness of someone assigning a guard post. "Okay," I said. The word was small and carried the weight of agreement. What followed was a tenderness that did not erase the uneven ledger between us. There were nights in which we were careful, and nights in which we were bright and loud in the privacy of a room that had never been mine. We learned each other's edges. He learned to bring painkillers when my rib flared. I learned how to make him coffee a certain way, no sugar, heavy cream, stirred once. He discovered my habit of straightening picture frames just slightly off-center. We negotiated how much of me could be kept separate, my finances, my sister, the hours I would continue to work. He offered me a job in the house that meant a salary, benefits, and an official title. It was a step off the invisible track into a place where my name could be on a payroll and not just a note in the margins. I hesitated. Taking the job would mean being there more. seen more. It would also mean economic stability. The house had a proper contract. It included paid time off, health benefits, and a clause that the staff would be protected while on duty. There was a line specifying that the house would cover emergency medical costs, a clause I stared at like it was a rare kind of mercy. "Am I signing away my options?" I asked the man who'd already assumed some authority over my nights. He sat across from me at his desk and looked at the contract like a curious animal. "You sign for work," he said simply. "If you want to leave, you leave. You don't have to be here because of me. Be here if you want to be." I studied the paper and then the man. He didn't say it would be easy. He didn't promise me a life without corners, but he promised a balance sheet that allowed me room to breathe. We negotiated terms: days off that couldn't be canceled without 2 weeks' notice, an agreement that Brittany would be offered household cookwork with the pay adjusted so she could choose, the guarantee that my mother's medical care would remain paid as long as my employment stood. He resisted a clause that would make me bound to him forever. He argued that such paperwork was unnecessary if his word was sufficient. "Words can be broken," I told him. "I need protection that lasts." He listened. He added the clause, in black and white, that the house would continue to provide health care for my mother for a year, regardless of my employment status. It was a grace that felt both generous and strategic. He didn't ask me to kneel for it. He offered it like a fact he had decided on. I signed. The weeks after, our intimacy settled into a pattern that was at once domestic and strange. He learned to hang my coat with care and not to touch the laundry in my drawer without asking. He learned to step lightly when I needed to sleep because of the ache in my ribs. I learned his silence and when it hid decisions. I learned how to ask for what I needed and still maintain the line where myself didn't become merely an extension of his will. There were moments of dissonance. One afternoon, when I went to the east entrance to retrieve linens, I saw a delivery for another house, Krasniki's name on a folded slip. The rival's reach was a shadow in the corners of our days. News circulates differently when you're inside a house that matters. Small things arrive: rumors, a man's absence from a usual cafe, a silence where there had once been noise. Krasniki reached out with a kind of oily courtesy that smelled like negotiation. He called for a meeting under the pretense of civility. He wanted to offer an olive branch, money, a parcel of neutral territory, and a quiet request that the incident be handled in a way that did not make trouble for his house. He wanted to buy peace. Giovanni did not like being bought. He did not like being told where his lines were invisible. At a dinner in his private dining room, set with low lights and the sharp scent of rosemary and meat roasting, Krasniki sat across from him with his second-in-command. The conversation started with the courtesies of men who shared a city and moved quickly into the language of calendars and territory. Krasniki's voice was honey and threat. "An accident may have occurred," he said, smiling the way a man smiles when he expects the other man to understand the calculation. "We do not want an escalation. My house is old business for us, and for you, why make waves?" Giovanni listened. When he replied, his voice was the same low tide it had always been. "Whoever thought it was a message to you used my uniform to make the point. That is a mistake." He named no one. He didn't need to. A look slid across the table like a blade. We can accept an apology. We can accept a check. Or we can accept that some people must learn the city has rules. Krasniki laughed once, a sound like money being counted. "You could have taken what's safe," he said. "Take the money. Let the matter disappear." Giovanni's response was quiet and cold. "I choose stability," he said, "not a field of corpses you own. We stay where we are. The city needs order. If you can't keep your men from marking other people's property, then you will have to rearrange your methods." It was an ultimatum dressed as policy. Krasniki bristled. "You think you can lecture me?" Giovanni's hand rested on the table,
Fingers splayed, as if you were reading rings in the wood grain. I think I'm offering you a route out. Take it. He didn't offer expansion. He offered a map to de-escalation. You control what you control. Keep it contained. Krasniki's eyes flashed. You playing at nobility now? No, Giovanni said. I am playing at living. It was not a threat of overt war. It was a refusal to be provoked into expansion. It was a decision made with an eye to the edges of what he would risk. For my sake, for reasons I could not fully name then, he opted for a different ledger. He would not seize Krasniki's territory if doing so meant dragging me into a storm that would not be about my ribs and my mother's bills anymore. He would choose stability. The weeks that followed were a study in pressure and its release. Krasniki's operations began to fray in small ways. A shipment delayed, a contact quietly flipped, a courier's route exposed. Someone in his circle found their plans intercepted. Rumors wove through the city's underside. A man in Krasniki's inner circle was found dead in a hotel. A single, inexplicable anomaly that the papers wrote off as misadventure. The truth, as always, lived in the mouths of men who don't tell half the story. I watched the shifting like an outsider with a new vantage point. A woman who could see a chessboard because she was now allowed in a room where decisions were made.
I felt the moral weight of it in the nights when I couldn't sleep. The same hollow satisfaction that had hollowed me the first night the men sat in Giovanni's study. The city's adjustments had real people on both sides. There were always consequences. When the news that Krasniki was gone became a whisper that turned to certainty, the house contracted in a way I could feel in the silverware. Hands moved a hair quicker, voices were lower. Men who had seemed untouchable were suddenly the subject of gossip and speculation. There were men who expected Giovanni to flood the streets and take advantage of the vacuum. There were men who sharpened knives at the thought. Giovanni surprised people by doing almost nothing. He made no sudden moves to annex territory. He did, however, secure his own borders. He tightened the house's logistics and focused on keeping his people safe. He made alliances smaller and more reliable. To me, he said, "Violence answers violence for a night. What we need is to be here in the morning." That choice felt like an answer to who he was becoming. He was not merely a man who avenged. He was a man balancing a calculation with a life at stake. Mine, and, indirectly, the lives of those who worked in his house. He opted for a kind of restraint that I did not expect from a man of his trade. The city, which had feared an eruption at dawn, found itself holding its breath at the quiet instead. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do in a city of knives is not to pick one up. Brittany watched the change with a practical sort of watchfulness. She came over one evening with a dish of food, her way of marking normal, and sat on the edge of my couch. "You look different," she said, chopping a bite of something and looking at me like a woman assessing a piece of fruit. "In what way?" I asked. "Less afraid to be here," she said. "You still flinch at doors, but you hold your head. I'm not saying it's all good. I'm just saying it looks like you have more room." "Room is expensive," I said. "It's less expensive than being buried under bills," she replied. We talked about the terms I had negotiated with Giovanni. She pressed me in ways she knew I needed pressing. "You're not a charity," she said. "You're not a prize. Remember that." "I signed a contract," I said, "and he paid the bills." "Okay," she said. "So, keep your life." She taught me a rule I would remember. Gratitude doesn't mean surrender. It means you name what you owe and you keep the rest for yourself. Months went by and the ache in my ribs softened into a memory. At times, shadows crossed me, men in other neighborhoods who resented the way I had been lifted, whispers that my protection was leverage. But there was also the daily brightness of being seen, a salary that meant no more counting change for antibiotics,
a medical card that took roses out of my mother's chest, a kitchen where Brittany's laughter became part of the mansion's background.
Giovanni and I reached an uneasy equilibrium. We were lovers, yes, but our intimacy was threaded through with the complicated ledger of power. There were conversations where I told him plainly what I would not accept. There were other conversations in which he admitted, rarely and like one admitting a breach of privacy, that his world had angered him. He didn't dress his actions as heroic. He explained them like a mechanic explaining effects: what needed oiling, what needed replacement, what would be left to rust. He made no pretense of righteousness. One night, after a storm blew across the city and left the marble slick with rain, we stood on the terrace that overlooked the river. The dawn was a carved thing, pale and decisive. Cars hissed on the faraway road. The city looked like a map with pins in it. I felt the wind cut at the edges of my coat. He lit a cigarette and then offered it to me without judgment. I took it with trembling fingers and didn't smoke it. He watched. "You look different at dawn," he said. "So do you." I couldn't help the smallness of the compliment. He turned to me then, and for a moment the two of us were the only things on the terrace. The city was a landscape of alarms and softened edges. Beyond us, the undercurrent of life continued. Deals were made. People moved like marbles around the edges of the law. "Who was responsible for this?" he asked, the old question returning like a motif, softer now than when it had first been sharp. I thought of Darren and Victor, of the men who had been tied in his study, of Krasnicki's absence, and of all the choices that had been made under chandeliers and in alleys. I thought of my mother and the stack of invoices that no longer had a number at the top. I thought of Brittany's head on my shoulder and the way our kitchen smelled like rosemary. "You were," I said at last, surprising myself with the accuracy of the answer. It wasn't an accusation. It was a recognition. He had been the architect of the response. He had decided what the city would feel when dawn came. He had asked the question and then answered it in the way he preferred, with precision and a code that balanced protection and restraint. He didn't correct me. Instead, he pulled me close and wrapped his arms around me with an expression that had room for shame and pride and something kinder. "I took responsibility," he said. "I chose the way." "And you chose not to take everything," I added. The sentence landed between us like an agreement. "Yes," he said, "because some things are not worth winning." We stood in silence then, and the city unspooled below us. Taxi lights like constellations, windows coming to life like small hearths. There was danger in the city still. There would always be a coastline of danger. Men who took offense found ways to respond. But there was also the quiet that comes when someone with power decides to prioritize life over spectacle. It doesn't erase the ledger, but it changes where the line is drawn. Back inside, across from the desk where the clock kept time, my life had rearranged. I had a job with pay and benefits. Brittany worked as the cook who had been asking for a chance to learn a new pastry method and was given hours that allowed her to earn more than she had in the diner. My mother's letters, once thin with worry, began to read like someone coming up for air. There were small dinners at the house, where I served at a table with other staff and heard jokes that weren't mine, but that we made ours. I still made the bed in the small Bronx apartment we kept for privacy, and sometimes I'd go there at the weekends to sleep under my own window, to hear my sister breathe without the hum of chandeliers. Not everything aligned neatly. I had moments of shame, friends who looked at me in ways that wondered about the exchange I had made. I had nights where my stomach twisted with the memory of two men in Giovanni's study and a satisfaction that felt compromised. There were whispers at times, men who suggested things about my motives or my character that were brutal in their simplicity. I learned to answer with a practiced phrase: "I keep my own books now." It shut conversation down the way a closed ledger does. Giovanni continued to be Giovanni. Complex, dangerous, capable of making decisions that had weight. He was not reformed. He did not need to be.
He had made room for something gentler in his life, which was a radical thing because his life had been built on a different scale. He learned small gentlenesses too. He learned to draw a bath the way I liked it, hot, with too many towels at the ready. He learned which songs made me stop and listen. He learned my mother's name and said it correctly. We were, both of us, negotiating what it meant to live together without reducing the other to a single role. There were promises that didn't need paper: respect, being allowed to leave if I chose, the guarantee that the house's protection would not be used as a leash. And there were promises that did: the contract, the line about my mother's care for a year, the salary that allowed me to consider school or saving in a way I hadn't before. One dawn, months after those two men had been pulled into the study, we stood on the terrace again. The city was the color of worn denim and beginning to sigh into mourning. Giovanni asked me, not for the first time, but with the old weight, "Do you regret it?" I had learned to answer honestly. "Sometimes," I said, "but I regret not making choices sooner, not letting myself be seen when I could have created better options." He listened, a man who amassed territory and who understood loss. "Then we will keep making room," he said. We both understood there would be consequences to every decision. We both understood that the city would always demand tolls. But in the space between the alley where I had been hit and the terrace where we stood, there had been a kind of alchemy. A hurt had become a currency. A protection had become a choice. A question had become an answer. Who was responsible for this? He had asked once, in the silence of the study, the words like a bell. He asked again later, in dawn's light. Each time the question changed its meaning. The first time it was an interrogation. The second time it was an ownership of consequence. At the edge of the city, men spoke of him in low voices and measured looks. Dawn found people holding their breath, waiting to see which way the ledger would fall. The answer, as it always was, sat in the quiet actions that followed a decision. Giovanni had chosen not to expand on grief. He had chosen a kind of measured, reluctant mercy. He had taken responsibility in his own way. It made the city uneasy, because power had a new contour. It made my life legible in ways I hadn't imagined. I had been invisible for 8 months. Then I was seen. Seeing doesn't always feel like grace. It can feel like collision. But when someone who knows how to make things cease to be invisible chooses to protect you without erasing you, the world changes. There are still scars. There are still ledger entries. I carry them like a map. We watched the skyline as the sun nicked the glass of a distant office tower, a single line of light like a seam. The city was waking, 1,000 choices unfolding at once. People would keep making them, some honorable, some small and self-serving. Some would be cruel. But in that slice of morning, with the salt air like a promise, I felt a different kind of possible. I had a job. My mother had a cleared ledger, at least for now. I had a man who asked the question, answered it on my behalf, and then chose not to make my safety cost me my agency. Who was responsible for this? He had asked. He had not only asked, he had arranged the answer. People in the city feared at dawn because his quiet had consequences. They feared that the silence wasn't emptiness, but a calibrated control. They feared because powerful men who choose restraint confound expectation. I folded my hands in the warmth of his jacket and said softly, "We both had our part, but you gave me a choice." He tightened his arms around me, like someone making sure a fragile thing would stay intact. "Then keep choosing," he said, and the command was gentle. Outside, the city continued its business. Inside, I finally felt like someone who could sign their name without needing a shadow to hold the pen. The dawn held us like a verdict, soft, dangerous, and true.